First of all, I'd like to thank Leslie for her kind invitation. I would also like to encourage all in the Seattle area to visit the current stunning Lone exhibition from Stockholm's National Museum. Some of these paintings I first encountered at the legendary Northern Light exhibition held in 1982 at the Brooklyn Museum, an experience that determined the trajectory of my professional career. I am therefore particularly pleased to speak to you today about young Swedish artists who wanted, on the one hand, to create works that express their essential innermost identities, and on the other, to promote a democratic and egalitarian Swedish society. As we shall see, authenticity and empathy were the strategies with which they hoped to accomplish their purpose. But first, a little background. 1889 was a watershed year in Swedish art. It occurred at the Paris World's Fair, the one for which Gustave Eiffel built his so-called Tower of 300 meters. This was Paris's third World's Fair, the one celebrating the centennial of the storming of the Bastille, the event that ignited the French Revolution. At that time, politics were on everybody's mind, particularly since the 1880s had been a decade of intensive labor organizing and rapidly rising national social class consciousness. National identity consciousness also had risen to the fore, a development stimulated by Napoleon Bonaparte's ambition earlier in the century to unite all Europe into a single empire with Paris as its capital. Although this threat terminated with Napoleon's exile to St. Helena in 1815, European nations got busy protecting themselves by unifying their inhabitants and establishing their independence. Greece and Belgium in 1830, Italy in 1861, Germany in 1871, and Serbia and Bosnia in 1878. These twin concerns, fostering social solidarity and formulating a generic national identity, inspired progressive Swedish painters beginning in the mid-1880s. Sweden was the first Scandinavian nation to industrialize, and Swedes, the antecedents of Joe Hill and the international workers of the world, were enthusiastically engaged in the struggle for social equality. Sweden's first labor unions formed in the 1880s, and today, the vast majority of Swedes belong to one. This even includes employers. There's an employers union in Sweden. Swedish artists created their own union in 1886 and were quickly labeled the opponents by the Swedish press. Although not oppressed in the same way as industrial workers, they felt solidarity with them. Industrialization destabilized the relative social equality that had always existed in this historically poor nation, with no history of tyrannical aristocrats of the sort that existed in continental Europe. In addition, like industrial workers, they made things with their hands. The decisive factor compelling progressive Swedish artists to organize, however, was the stranglehold on the Swedish art market exerted by the extremely conservative Royal Academy of Art. Aside from infrequent Academy-sponsored exhibitions held in Stockholm, artists had no reliable way to show their paintings to the Swedish public. And the only works of art accepted by the Academy jury were those that conformed to the parameters of style and subject dictated by the Academy. This situation frustrated Swedish painters, who found their art evolving under the inspiration of their exposure to foreign influences, while in Germany, Spain, Italy, and France. And by France, I mean Paris. Foreign influence was not the problem, though. Change was. The Swedish Royal Academy, founded in 1775, adopted its principles from the French Royal Academy established in 1648 during the reign of Louis XIV. The Royal Academy's mission was to preserve the status quo, to maintain in the realm of visual culture the historical continuity that underpinned Sweden's monarchy. It was only after the French Academy in Paris established a scholarship in landscape painting in 1816, and after the exhibition of English painter John Constable's landscapes at the French Academy exhibition of 1824 ignited interest in landscape painting, that Swedish painters traveled to the continent, mainly to Dusseldorf and Paris, in order to learn about this new trend. Edvard Barry won a scholarship to spend 3 years studying in Dusseldorf and Paris in the 1850s. When he returned in 1857, he was invited to establish a landscape class at the Swedish Academy. In Barry's rocky landscape in Småland, we see the landscape painting format that became the official style of the Swedish Academy. One evolved from the paintings of French artists Nicolas Poussin and Claude Lorrain in the 17th century. Barry placed the main subject, a lumber mill, at the exact center of the canvas, but included the human figure required to elevate the image, to make it significant. After all, it is human labor that improves the nature provided by the divine creator. The scene is bracketed by 2 dark masses of trees and rock, and a stream that guides our eye gently into the background. 2 decades later, Ferdinand Hernlund utilized the same formula in his landscape, also from the southern province of Småland. He replaced the human figure with signs of human improvement, a mill, a well-tended field, and human habitation in the shore in the background. Landscapes deviating drastically from this formula were rejected from the Academy exhibitions in Stockholm. More interesting for Swedish artists than contending with the Royal Academy's exclusivity was the opportunity to submit works to the Paris Salon, a prestigious honor for all aspiring foreign artists residing in Paris. Swedish painters in Paris especially admired works by Jean-Charles Cazin, who debuted at the Salon exhibition of 1876. As you can see, painters like Anselm Schultzberg and Niels Kruger, both of whom were in Paris during the 1870s and 80s, emulated the gentle naturalism of Cazin, regardless of whether they depicted rural scenes from France, as in Kruger's painting of a farmer leading horses through a village, or urban scenes from Stockholm, as in Schultzberg's painting of the orphanage demolition. In fact, there is little geographical specificity in any of these scenes. But the goal of Kruger and Schultzberg was to impress viewers with their ability to produce paintings according to the highest standards, and those standards were established in Paris. Because they needed to earn a living, they also prioritized easily saleable images rather than ones that struck a responsive chord in their own souls. Another way Swedish painters sought to impress audiences at home was by offering evidence of their immersion in foreign cultures. By painting portraits of peasants in exotic places like Spain, Bavaria, and Normandy, Josefsson, Hirsch, and Kaiser signaled their status as world citizens. Not only did they capture the specificities of costume and physiognomy, but perhaps, and more importantly, the characters, the inner qualities of these individuals. Due to their anonymity, these figures also represent national types. Jaunty, self-confident Spanish smiths, a reticent young Bavarian woman, and a pious Norman girl. Such paintings provided opportunities for armchair travel for homebound Swedes. Now, you might be wondering, with all these Swedish artists in Paris, eager for new ideas, why have I not yet mentioned Impressionism? Many within the expatriate Scandinavian community did attend the Impressionist and many other exhibitions in Paris. In fact, the reception rooms of journals and newspapers, the studios of photographers, and a growing number of art galleries hosted exhibitions and provided near constant stimulation for eager young painters. Carl Hill was atypical of his Swedish colleagues and far more independent. He listened to his inner voice, painting works like Steep Ascent in Montigny-sur-Loing, a scene from a village neighboring Grès-sur-Loing, the summer headquarters of Swedish Artists. With its sketchy execution and banal subject, Steep Ascent is closer to Claude Monet's paintings from the same year than to those of any other Swedes. The opponents were directly inspired by the Impressionists, but perhaps not in the way you might imagine. When they decided to form a secessionist group in 1885 in order to mount exhibitions in Stockholm, they adapted the charter of the Impressionists, who called their organization, as you see in the catalog cover on the left, they called their organization the Anonymous Society of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, Gravers, Engravers, etc. The Anonymous Society had in turn based its charter on that of the Pontoise Bakers Union, so a group of actual workers. Progressive Swedish artists in Paris had the same aspirations as the Impressionists: to mount unjuried group exhibitions accessible to the general public, for which the artists themselves selected the works they would exhibit. Unlike the Impressionists, all but one of whose exhibitions lost money and which sold few works, the Swedish Artists Union mounted wildly successful exhibitions that made money, sold artworks, and attracted an enthusiastic new group of art collectors. During the same period, the only collectors interested in purchasing paintings by French Impressionists were parvenu Americans, self-made men who appreciated innovation more than tradition. That's why many of the most important Impressionist paintings are in the US and not in France. Thus, during the second half of the 1880s, the Artists Union fostered a collecting spirit among affluent, entrepreneurial, and politically progressive Swedes. But what happened in 1889 that made that such a watershed year in Swedish painting? It was the reviews of the art pavilions at the Paris World's Fair. Since the first World's Fair was held at London's Crystal Palace in 1851, World's Fairs functioned as competitive events where first world nations flaunted their modernity and progress. In 1889, Thomas Edison had an entire pavilion showcasing his inventions. French critics at the World's Fair evaluated works of art according to the degree to which they evidenced the singular character of their national origins, rather than the extent to which they emulated great paintings produced elsewhere. Swedes, for instance, were criticized for their skillful creation of French nuanced scenes, such as that we saw by Kruger, while Norwegians, their chief if friendly rivals on the field of national identity politics, were singled out for their skillful were singled out for their skillful creation, the degree to which, they evidenced their national origins. Erik Werenskiold's Peasant Burial was the work critics identified as the one that most evidenced the Norwegian character in landscape painting. Werenskiold had been in Paris, but stayed only 2 years and returned to Norway in 1883, just enough time to learn important skills but apparently not long enough to lose his Norwegian identity. Critics praised the rural, mountainous setting, the healthy, community-oriented peasants, and the crystalline light and clean air of a Nordic summer day. By 1889, critical and financial successes at home, escalating political engagement, and confirmation that they needed to paint in a more honest and Swedish manner in terms of both style and subject brought progressive Swedish painters home. They wanted to make a difference in society, and they now saw an exhilarating and important role for themselves as reformers of Swedish society and taste, rather than purveyors of luxury goods for the wealthy. Opponent artists were singularly suited to this challenge because it was the bourgeoisie that purchased their paintings, the same class that determined social conditions. Their goal was to encourage social solidarity through the embrace of a generic national identity. This ambition had been a goal of Swedish bureaucrats since at least 1842, the year 7 years of compulsory education was instituted in Sweden. Opponent artists, like the rest of their generation, had been educated within this system, which provided a single narrative of Swedish history and culture that furnished common ground for social progress. The first task, of course, was to paint Swedish subjects, especially those perceived as familiar, typical, or unique. Not the haunts of fashionable society or tourist destinations, but places either deeply personal or broadly familiar. Ivar Newberry, who had resided in Paris and Gray, painted this scene from Sweden's rocky west coast in Fjällbacka. He depicted a spot that had become popular with affluent residents of Göteborg for hiking once scientists had advertised the healthfulness of physical activity in nature. Newberry included fashionable folks, those who knew about the salubrious benefits of such activities and who had the leisure time to make such excursions. In contrast, Carl Nordstrom, who hailed from the West Coast not far from where Newberry painted, recorded a view of industrial Stockholm with smoke-belching chimneys scattered across Söder, Stockholm's South Island. Skansen is a geographical term that designates a hilltop fortification. Upon his return from Paris, Nordstrom resided briefly in a yellow house located on the property that you see here that would become in 1891 the first world's open-air museum, Skansen. While their subjects are Swedish and easily identifiable, the ways in which Newberry and Nordstrom painted evidenced clear traces of French influence in their dull tonalities and loose brushwork, especially in the case of Nordstrom. Neither artist painted the places they were from, an element that grew in significance with the urge for authenticity. In a letter to Richard Barry, Edvard's politically engaged painter's son, Nordstrom wrote that the opponents should paint, and I quote, "with our heart's reddest blood," end quote, which had the double meaning of social solidarity, since red is the color of socialism, and of blood, of honesty, since one describes best the thing one knows most intimately. The effect that opponent values had on even conservative mainstream painters emerges in these works by minor Swedish artists. Lindman's image of a ship entering Stockholm harbor is characterized by muted contrasts and gray skies. He does select a spot with features identifiably from Stockholm, the rugged granite hill at left, the architecture of the yellow building behind it, and particularly the skyline of two of Stockholm's islands, Riddarholm and Old Town, in the background. The spires poking up from the horizon are easily identifiable. At left is Riddarholm Church, where the kings of Sweden are buried. To its right, the tallest spire is the German church, built for Stockholm's German community. and which continues to hold Lutheran services in German, and at right, Stora kyrkan, the big church, Stockholm's cathedral, located just beside the royal palace. Admittedly, there are days in Stockholm that look just like this. But 15 years later, Alfred Bergström painted a similar view in wintertime with greater attention to climatic specificity. He selected a different yet clearly identifiable location. Bergström also depicted the scene under conditions occurring only at high latitudes. It is a cold day, well below freezing, as evidenced by the limpid air and snow consistency. The time of year is probably late January or early February, judging from the angle of the sun and the intensity of the light. Intensity fosters emotional engagement. Swedes would experience a familiar and visceral response to this setting. They know how this moment in winter looks and feels. It's a shared cultural experience. Still, Bergström paints with attention primarily to potential buyers. He doesn't paint with his heart's reddest blood. In a way, returning to Stockholm and painting the landscape of one's childhood, as many opponents did, also conformed to the Impressionist agenda. Inspired by Charles Baudelaire's directive to become historians of their own time, painters of modern life, Impressionist artists focused on their varied milieu. The wealthy Gustave Caillebotte on the swank 8th arrondissement, where his father had just built a private apartment building for family members. Claude Monet on his family in Paris and at the Norman coast. Renoir on the working class of Montmartre. In the works of artists committed equally to representing modern life and to marketability rather than to communicating deeply personal feelings, one finds a generic resemblance regardless of nationality or location, as you can see from these scenes from Linköping in central Sweden, Creil, and near Florence in Raffaello Cernesi's Pergola. Most of the opponents were committed to absolute authenticity. Initially, and in reaction to critiques at the Paris World's Fair, many returned to their native tracts in order to return to their roots, geographically and psycho-emotionally. Carl Larsson went back to Stockholm, where he spent a poverty-stricken childhood, but became rapidly attached to the cottage in central Sweden that his wife Karin Berge inherited in 1888. The surrounding woods of the village of Sundborn provided the setting for this watercolor of his son Ulf. Like Larsson, Eugen Jansson was a member of Stockholm's struggling working class. Because he never won a scholarship, he also never left Stockholm. He spent his life on the industrial working class, now hipster, island of Söder. Jansson lived nearby and often painted from this spot on the escarpment across from Old Town and Kungsholmen. Nordstrom spent increasing amounts of time on his native island of Tjörn, north of Göteborg, and Anders Zorn established himself in his native village of Mora in central Sweden, where, as local legend has it, half the inhabitants can trace their ancestry to him. Zorn was a very sociable fellow. Richard Barry was a theoretician and polemicist among his opponent colleagues. In his essay, Nordic Nature and Nordic Art, he noted that, quote, Norway has no art academy, but it does have Norwegian art, end quote, hoping to encourage his colleagues to shrug off learned academic and foreign conventions in order to produce from the heart. He believed that the goal of art should be similar to that of music. Music combines notes whose tonalities vary according to the instrument producing them. The ideal result is a harmony that in turn awakens particular emotions in the listener. A firm believer in affect, Barry advised artists to consider how they could combine color and line in order to generate visual harmonies that would activate feelings of empathy and camaraderie among Swedes. Although he offered no guidelines other than honesty and humility, he believed art should be directed inward toward spiritual development and outward toward egalitarian social reform. To accomplish this, it was essential that artists choose their subjects and techniques in harmony with the ideas and feelings of their era. The result should be a painting that immediately upon viewing stimulates a particular feeling. It should, in Barry's words, quote, build a bridge between the artwork and the viewer that invites the viewer into the emotional world inhabited by the artist as they painted, end quote. The goal is for viewers to experience the same feelings as did the artist while painting. Artworks should be products of self-expression that communicate clearly to Swedish contemporaries similarly rooted in their own domestic and regional locales. Artists needed to investigate approaches that accurately express their feelings and ideas. As a consequence, while many focused on landscape, a distinguishing feature of Sweden, just as Impressionists focused on sociability, a distinguishing feature of France, they simultaneously sought visual languages to effectively accomplish this. For Larsson, this meant working primarily in watercolor on paper, a technique that conveys a sense of immediacy and spontaneity because it dries quickly, and luminosity because watercolor pigments don't completely conceal the white paper into which they soak. This luminosity captures the experience of a summer day in central Sweden, where at midsummer the sun barely dips beneath the horizon at night. One can read outdoors at midnight, and by 2 a.m., it is again broad daylight. This is an experience Southerners don't understand unless they've experienced it, like inhaling mosquitoes. Ulf is carefree and at ease in nature. Fellow opponent artist Bruno Liljefors observed that nature offers far better opportunities for developing physical fitness than do gymnasiums. Clothing, the trappings of society, lying in a heap on a small wooden stand. Larsson composed his painting symmetrically, reinforcing a sense of harmony and stability. On the left, Ulf, contented, unself-conscious, and undisturbed by thorns, insects, or any other of nature's inconveniences, strikes a relaxed pose. On the right side of the birch divider are the trappings of civilization, clothing, a blue rowboat by the shore, and red-stained farm buildings across the stream. Larsson chose materials, watercolor, a setting, a birch wood beside water and near a farm, and a time of day and year, midday at midsummer, with which all Swedes were familiar and that many would link to childhood memories of growing up in the countryside or visiting relatives who lived there, experiences often associated with strong memories and emotions. Larsson's subject, his son walking naked in the birchwood, suggests a symbiotic, even biomystical relationship between the boy and the benevolent nature where he wanders. Nowhere is this idea of the interconnectedness of humans, especially youth, with nature, better expressed than in this work by Larsson's student, Gustav Fjestad, who represents this young man connected to earth, water, and air as a secular saint by giving him a halo. His eyes, the organs of materialist desire, are closed, permitting him to complete a circuit of empathy and inner animation that integrates him with, rather than separating him from, nature. The effects of capitalism sever people from nature, and the opponents believed that addressing this imbalance was crucial to realigning Sweden on the path of symbiosis and harmony. Eugen Jansson, though, made different choices. He painted a familiar view of Stockholm, a city of islands. The water separating Söder from Kungsholm is Riddarfjärden, a stretch of brackish water between the open sea and Lake Mällar. This peaceful mingling of two dissimilar environments evokes the efforts of opponent artists and socially progressive Swedes in general to create common ground between the affluent bourgeoisie and the impoverished peasant and working classes. Jansson suppressed detail and evidence of activity. He minimized the contrast between land and water by depicting them on a late spring evening during the so-called blue hour, when twilight lingers and the glow of sunset along the horizon is palely reflected in the water. It's a peaceful moment, conducive to reverie and reflection. The subtle colors mingle in quasi-spiritual harmony. Jansson knew this place well, and his attachment to it can be intuited by the tranquil manner in which he painted it. While it may be difficult to see in reproduction, Jansson painted in oil on a purposefully coarse canvas, whose texture is palpable when you see this painting in person. Rather than the paint adhering to the canvas surface, as was typically the case since the invention of oil on canvas painting in the late 15th century, Jansson's thin pigments soak into the canvas, merging with it, a kind of alchemical marriage in which two substances lose their independent identities while creating in harmony to create something larger, different, and better than what they could do on their own, an aesthetic expression of Jansson's hopes for Swedish society. In March 1893, Carl Nordstrom visited a Gauguin Van Gogh exhibition in Copenhagen, where Gauguin's wife Mette lived with their children. He discovered that Gauguin had found the material solution he was looking for. Several of Gauguin's exhibited paintings were oil on burlap, initially a pragmatic solution to his difficulty obtaining art supplies while in Tahiti. Burlap, though, was the answer to Nordstrom's desire to find art materials that expressed the coarseness of Sweden's West Coast landscape. Burlap also accomplished the modernist goal of tipping off viewers to the fact that they were looking at a created two-dimensional object hanging on a wall and not gazing through a window, either real or virtual, at a scene precisely rendered by the artist. Burlap was cheap and used mainly for making grain storage sacks. It may also appeal to Nordstrom because it was a non-art material associated with goods and labor. But one would never mistake Nordstrom's painting for one by Gauguin. His somber colors communicate a mood far more contemplative and brooding than any found in Gauguin's paintings from Brittany. And unlike Gauguin, Nordstrom painted the colors he saw, not the colors he felt, as Gauguin did in Blue Trees. Both artists did, however, simplify what they saw. They distilled their subjects in order to create a more emphatic emotional impact. In Nordstrom's painting, the horizontal stillness of the land, with its deep tones of brown and green, featureless except for two nearly leafless trees, contrasts dramatically with the turbulent sky, dominated by a wispy white cloud that appears more exuberant than threatening. Nordstrom visited the Van Gogh Gauguin exhibition in Copenhagen together with Richard Barry, Niels Kruger, and the Göteborg banker and collector Pontus Furstenberg, who was the opponent's greatest supporter. They, along with Carl Larsson and occasionally August Strindberg, settled for a few years in Varberg, a seaside resort south of Göteborg. The location was chosen not only for its historical significance and proximity to Furstenberg, who had recently funded the frescoes that Larsson painted in the foyer of a girls' school in Göteborg. Here, Larsson embellished the walls with the history of Swedish women from prehistory through the Viking Age and up to the then present. As far as I know, this is the first project ever to document important contributions of women throughout history, a kind of antecedent to Judy Chicago's dinner party from the 1970s. Thus, gender equality, as well as parity among social classes, was a conscious objective of opponent artists. Larsson's murals and the choice of Varberg as a location was important to Swedish painters. They would have agreed with Bob Marley, who observed that you don't know who you are if you don't know where you're from. Varberg Fortress was a landmark familiar to all Swedes and was once the southernmost stronghold of the Swedish kingdom during the medieval period when Denmark occupied southern Sweden. Both Barry and Nordstrom set their scenes at twilight, the time of day most conducive to reflection, a necessary step on the path to empathy and reform. Varberg lies in the province of Halland. We saw with Fjestad's Boy Who Sees with His Heart the impulse to sanctify nature, to treat it with the proper reverence for a gift from the divine creator. This inclination to remind the Swedish public of the inestimable value of their life-sustaining nature is evidenced by Kruger's Spring in Halland, with 3 panels set in a triptych frame made by the artist that is embellished further with carvings and precious gold leaf, like a Renaissance religious painting. Kruger represented a cultivated landscape where humans and nature have always coexisted. One critic felt that it, quote, had something of a bucolic poetry cycle from antiquity about it, end quote. Barry wrote that evolution was not only biological, but also sociological, and that it was the duty of Swedish artists to encourage their nation along a path of equality, harmony, and sustainability. Because progressive Swedish painters viewed their mission as a public one, they embraced opportunities to provide inspirational paintings in schools, banks, post offices, museums, and other public buildings. Their alliance with progressive politics is evidenced by the fact that many of them donated paintings to Stockholm's House of the People when it opened in 1902. Houses of the People were an initiative of the Social Democratic Party. They were gathering places built in most towns and offered a library, meeting rooms, lectures on topics from art to horticulture, and classes on a wide variety of topics, intellectual as well as practical. In the early 1890s, while Larsson was painting his girls' school frescoes, Barry and Larsson taught at Valland, the art school in Göteborg. Esther Almqvist from Stockholm decided to study there with them rather than applying to the more prestigious state-sponsored Royal Academy. And she followed them back to Stockholm in 1892. While Barry and Larsson were granted relative freedom in their teaching, and they could hang out with the Furstenbergs while they were in Göteborg, Union artists had a more progressive and egalitarian pedagogical model in mind. They returned to Stockholm and founded the Free School in order to train a second generation of national romantic painters. The school was Barry's idea, and he took primary responsibility for running it. It taught the fundamentals of art and encouraged students to find their own paths, so long as they were rooted in their individual identities. They vehemently discouraged foreign travel because they considered it an impediment to developing a singular, authentically Swedish creative vision. Barry, Andersson, and the sculptor Per Hasselberg were the principal teachers, and they were unpaid. There were no entrance requirements, and as one student observed, quote, all sorts of people came, young and old, sheep and goats. They even came from the Royal Academy, end quote. In keeping with their egalitarian ideology, teachers shared the costs and tasks of upkeep, helping to clean the school, stoke the fire, and hire models. It was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Women and men worked side by side, even in the presence of nude models, a situation that may well have been an international first. Students subscribed to the union ethos of "to thine own self be true," and developed visual languages that at best expressed their individual intentions. They also focused on landscape, since nature had been identified and promoted in Sweden as the national common denominator. They sought to capture the essential and singular qualities of their native landscapes in manners that also expressed something fundamental about themselves, their love of their native land, particularly the corner of it from which they originated or grew up. This commitment to authenticity, they believed, would create an emotional bridge between the artist and the Swedish viewer, who might not know a particular setting, but could certainly identify with the palpable feeling of connection to place these works exuded. In 1903, Hesselboom painted Our Land, a scene from his native tract in Dalsland. Here, there are no indications of a human presence. We stand alone, as Hesselboom did, enjoying a magisterial view of the landscape from atop a hill at dusk. The fact that the earth is dark and the sky still light suggests that this was painted in early, or more likely late summer. Because the sun appears to move more slowly at this time of year, Hesselboom enjoyed this extended moment, just as we can when viewing his painting. Hesselboom creates a tranquil and solitary moment of reflection, both actual, in the way the sky transforms the water to a silver streak, and conceptual. The solitude in nature is an experience that all Swedes share. By creating an image that fosters love of homeland, regardless of one's social status or specific geographical location within Sweden, Hesselboom created a work that was at once autobiographical and generic. In school, Swedes learned their history and the characteristics of their country's widely divergent geography. Armed with a collective repository of cultural and historical knowledge and common experiences in nature, the Swedish bourgeoisie and general public embraced the ideas of equality, empathy, and sustainability promoted by progressive union artists. Building emotional bridges on a foundation of common values turned out to be a gratifying task, since it informed the trajectory of 20th century Sweden. Thank you. Tack.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful. I'd like to open it up to the audience if there are any questions for you. And just to give folks a little bit of time to craft those questions, I thought I'd open it up. So you talked about the significance of the landscape and looking at some of the works that are on view, for instance, those by Kruger and by Nordstrom, you see certain features very prominent. In this case, in the atmosphere, there's a certain significance of the cloud that you write about in Nationalism and the Nordic Imagination. Can you talk a little bit about the cloud and Swedish National Romanticism? And are there other kind of features of the atmosphere or the landscape that you see frequently depicted in the works of the 1890s?
Well, Swedish artists there's a long sketching tradition and therefore closely observing nature tradition that begins really in the 18th century with artists who are going to Italy, and then continues throughout the 19th century. And when artists returned to Sweden in 1889, they started looking at their nature in a very different and more perceptive sort of way, and they really wanted to identify those characteristics that were singular, that they didn't see elsewhere, because their main audience was Swedes. They were not really interested in communicating in any clear or demonstrative kind of way to people outside of Sweden, really. So they focused on these aspects that were singular to Sweden. I mean, also one finds them in Finland and Norway, and probably also in Russia, but maybe also in Alaska. But anyway, things that they felt were that everyone in the nation could latch onto. And one of these things is times of year, winter, the long nights of summer, the saturated colors of the sun when it's very low in the sky, and clouds. I've spent a lot of summers in Sweden, and the clouds there just really look a lot different. The clouds are whiter, they're more fluffy, they're more intense. Prince Eugen, who I did not talk about, but was a member of the royal family, and he couldn't join the secessionist group because he was part of the monarchy, but he was a sympathizer and a collector and supporter of these artists. He painted a well-known painting called The Cloud, which shows this enormous fluffy cloud in a blue sky. And he talks about how hard it was to paint it. He wrote in a letter, "I've had such trouble painting clouds this summer. I'm determined to get it right." And he painted a whole series of these giant fluffy clouds because they changed so quickly he couldn't capture it. So there's a kind of fascination with these moments in Sweden, and Fjestad and his many snow paintings, of painting these really singular moments in the geographical location from which these artists came. So,
thank you. We have a question from Joanna. She's curious if the effort to avoid travel outside of Sweden in order to establish a unique Swedish style actually worked in furthering their singular Swedish style and national identity.
It worked really well for a while. There's actually a dissertation that's going to be defended on the 1st of June, which talks about the kind of third generation, which didn't pay attention to that. So the Artists Union School, they were able to, the students who went there bought into the idea that they would be tainted if they left the homeland, and that they could learn everything they needed to from these artists who had been outside. And so Esther Almqvist, Otto Hesselboom, these artists tended to not stray very far for very long from their native tracts or from Sweden. But a younger generation that were maybe in their 20s after 1900, their response was, "Hey, you guys all went to France and Germany and Italy. We should get to do that too." So after 1900, especially after 1905, young Swedish artists, they went to France. There was a whole group of especially Norwegians and Swedes who studied with Matisse around 1910, and they had a very different agenda and rejected this kind of idea of nation building as something, especially after World War I, of something that was just outmoded and unnecessary, and just it didn't respond to them painting with their heart's reddest blood. They needed to go abroad.
So you talked a bit about that very important trip to Copenhagen and Den Frie Udstilling. So this question is connected to that. When was the Gagon exhibition in Sweden, and how many works were shown?
The exhibition I was talking about was in Copenhagen, and it was in 1893. a couple of, probably in the 90s, there was a museum in Copenhagen that did a restrike. They redid this entire exhibition with almost all of the original works. And I don't remember, and there's a catalog to this exhibition. I believe it was at Ordrupgård. And a couple of, I don't remember exactly, but somewhere I would guess between 50 and 60 paintings. Gauguin, once he experienced his midlife crisis and, abandoned his family, he tried to support them, and he sent many, if not most of his paintings back to his wife in Copenhagen from Tahiti or wherever else that he was to try to support them. So there was a great group of his paintings there, and also paintings by Van Gogh, with whom he worked in Brittany, in the south of France, in the fall of 1888. But this was such an important moment for them. It was really, 1889 was important in getting them back to Sweden, and 1893 was important in showing them new ways of painting that were more exciting to them than what the Impressionists had been doing.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about the support and the significance of using burlap over a finely woven canvas, for instance, with Carl Nordstrom. There's a painting in the exhibition by Janssen that also utilizes burlap. Is Janssen looking at Nordstrom? Are they, do they share, the same artistic ideology?
Janssen is looking primarily at Edvard Munch. And and I think if you look at the surface of his paintings, you see, he scrapes, he paints thinly. He's a more placid character than Munch was, so you don't see the kind of violence on the canvas, the physical violence on the canvas, or putting paintings out in the rain, or these other kinds of kind of extreme experimental techniques that Munch used. But this idea of the support and the paint working in concert was very important to both of them at this particular point. So it was came. Kruger, on the other hand, so Janssen didn't go to Copenhagen. The artists who did, including Kruger was very influenced, and you see this in Spring in Holland, by by Van Gogh's ink drawings, where he tends to use these little short graphic kind of dashes and dots and lines. And you see, beginning in 1893, Kruger incorporating that in his drawings for sure, but also into his paintings as well.
And you mentioned the frame for the Kruger, and we talked a bit about it before the program started. Are there any other artists at this time that are really thinking about the context of display and the frame? Bruno Liljefors. So if Kruger is thinking about, pieces of devotion in the context of display, what is Bruno Liljefors looking at, for instance, with independent works that are all framed together?
The same thing. There was limited time. I had to triage, but, and I'm very sorry to Bruno, because I really like him and I love going to the spots where he painted as well. So in the mid 1880s, he's assembling these small nature sketches. And for him, he was a real pantheist. For him, he had religious experiences, nature was his cathedral. And he was a hunter too. He spent a lot of time out of doors. He lived north of Stockholm, hiking, hunting, boating, just being in nature. So for him too, where he's looking with such care at minute moments in nature, where you almost wonder, how could he have done it with the optical methods available in the mid 1880s? They didn't have telephoto lenses then, and you feel that he's looking at things like a National Geographic photographer with a telephoto lens, and then capturing these moments of animals that are in motion as quickly as he possibly can. So it's a kind of, I would say for him, almost a kind of pantheistic meditation that reminds me almost of German romantic painters like Caspar David Friedrich, who really felt that nature was infused with divinity. And that also, you see that also in that last painting I showed by Richard Barry of the two bourgeois, who are looking at nature in that way. But he clearly does it. And the idea of frame making was important to him, but Kruger and also Fjestad were very interested also in woodworking, and they were expert at it. Yeah, they made many magnificent pieces of furniture. They made their own frames. And I think this interest in frame making came partly from artists, from neo-impressionist artists like Seurat, who were extremely concerned with the transition between the scene they painted and the wall on which it was displayed. And then often, as you see in the La Grande Jatte, a border that they paint of contrasting or whatever dots, where they paint their own frame onto the canvas as a way of transitioning to the wall. And so this idea of, and for Seurat, I think it's more of a transition thing. Swedish artists, I didn't talk about folk art or arts and crafts or that whole influence on them, but that is extremely strong. And one of the boundaries that they were trying to minimize was the boundary between folk art and fine art. For them, they had equal value. And so by engaging in physical making, they're creating objects of beauty that they also intended to be displayed on a wall. And so this kind of artisanal dimension for them was something that they were also quite proud of, those who engaged in it.
So we have a couple more questions. And one is about the reception of Swedish paintings outside of the Nordic countries.
Well, as I mentioned, there wasn't much of a way people could see Scandinavian painting outside of Scandinavia once after 1889, because there were several collectors who bought the vast majority of works that were produced. I mentioned Pontus Furstenberg and Göteborg. And then in Stockholm, there were two important collectors, Ernst Thiel, who was also a banker, and now there's the Thiel Gallery in Stockholm, and also Prince Eugen, the son of the reigning king and queen, who was himself a member of this group in terms of his painting and his sympathies, but he also bought a lot of works. So the first moment really, aside from, the World's Fair of 1889 and 1900 in Paris, that people really saw a lot of Scandinavian art was, as you know, at the big traveling exhibition that came to the United States in 1912 that traveled to New York, Minneapolis, and several other places. And this really, and one of the important places it traveled to was Buffalo, New York, which is when Canadian artists came down from Toronto mostly to see it, and then returned to Canada. And this was the moment of birth for the seven, the most important group of national painters in Canada. So yeah, people saw their works there, but mostly not. And then the next moment when people saw this art again was in the early 1980s, when there was another pan-Nordic exhibition that also traveled. It was at the Brooklyn Museum again and some other venues in New York. And this sparked a tremendous interest in Scandinavian painting, buying and collecting, to the extent that Christie's and Sotheby's for a number of years held Scandinavian-only sales. So it really, and this is the moment when August Strindberg transitions from becoming a writer that a lot of people found disturbing to being a painter that a lot of people admired. And so, yeah, those are the two moments where things really changed.
And another question asks about the influence of Expressionism and Fauvism on Swedish artists. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that became super important to the generation that were, that came of age around 1900. The ones who said, you guys went to Paris, so we're going there too. You can't stop us. And they went and they discovered Matisse, they discovered Fauvism, they discovered German Expressionism as well. Part of the way they did this also was not just through travel, but also there were many artist journals at the time, and there were also many exhibitions, both in galleries and museums, that enabled artists to see these works at firsthand. But the idea of using color and line for only expressive purposes that had nothing to do with mustering up a national identity or promoting social change, that would not have been, the earlier generation was very invested in social change. But also by the time these artists, the younger generation, went to Paris around 1910, Sweden seemed fairly safely on the trajectory envisioned by the social reformers of the 1880s and 90s. But this group of artists, the so-called Matisse students, they were also interested in reforming Swedish taste, and they believed that they also believed in affect, and they believed that the power of their works would change the way people thought and the way they behaved. So they were also invested in it. They just had a slightly different agenda with their artworks.
Well, we had one question about where people can learn more about this, and I would highly recommend getting their hands on this book, which has a permanent spot on my desk, Nationalism in the Nordic Imagination, Swedish Art of the 1890s, as well as your book, Symbolist Art and Context. Do you have any other suggestions?
I guess those are the main ones that are in English. I mean, those are the main things. There are, articles as well if one searches on JSTOR, but right. And there are a number of exhibition catalogs. There's some great exhibition catalogs from the late 80s and early 90s, from England, also Sweden. Scandinavia had sort of pan-Nordic exhibitions with catalogs also in English. I think it's really mainly exhibition catalogs, aside from this particular, my book, where one can find out more about these guys.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Michelle. This was a fantastic lecture. The exhibition is open until July 17th, so I highly encourage anyone who's in the Seattle area to come see these magnificent, there's 56 paintings by Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish artists on view. And I also want to thank our exhibition sponsors, Lotta Gavel Adams, Peter and Sophia Koo, in memory of Mrs. Evelyn Greathouse, Maria Stoff and William Jones, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Barbara Osher Pro Suecia Foundation, For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and the Scan Design Foundation for their support, as well as our exhibition partner, the National Museum in Stockholm. So thank you all for joining us. A special thanks to Michelle for this fantastic lecture.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.